Today we have a couple of exciting announcements. How many of you are in the play, The Scarlet Pimpernel? Do we have anybody in here? Okay, theater performance coming up this weekend, tonight through Saturday, and then next weekend as well, at 7:30 in the Black Box Theater across the hall. Don't miss it. It's going to be amazing. You can get tickets right after this convocation, so you don't have to wait in line tonight, okay? Just a reminder, my TA Sydney has office hours in the Convocation office in the Humanities Building Monday and Wednesday from 1 to 3 p.m. Also, next week's Convocation is Teresa Jordan. She is author of The Year of Living Virtuously. Now, here with us today is Dr. David Strayer. He is the director of the Center for Prevention of Distracted Driving at the University of Utah. Dr. Strayer is a professor of cognition and neurosciences in the Department of Psychology at the University of Utah. He received his PhD at the University of Illinois and worked at GTE Laboratories before joining the faculty at the U in 1991. Dr. Strayer is a fellow of the Association for Psychology Sciences and a recipient of the University of Utah Distinguished Scholarly and Creative Research Award. He has been researching and publishing on attention and driver's distraction for over 20 years, and his findings have led to national coverage, including interviews on The Oprah Show, Dr. Oz, Car Talk, and he's given several presentations and briefings to the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. The title of his presentation today is Why Talking to Your Car Drives You to Distraction. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Strayer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Adjust the volume a little bit. It's really an honor to be able to come and speak to this group. I'll come over here so I don't create a lot of echo. So it's really an honor to speak with you guys. What I want to talk to you about is stuff we've been doing for the last 15, 20 years, looking at what happens when you start to get distracted by some kind of an activity and it leads to some bad outcome. Talking to your car can drive you to distraction, and we're not talking about the kind of situation where someone talks to inanimate objects because they're thought disordered and they're just having a difficult time separating and judging reality. It's basically that now we're seeing that there's a lot of voice-based communication in the car. Your car, if you look at a new car now, it's configured so that you can talk to it, you can plug in your phone so that any of your smartphone functions now can be done in the car. The car is an extension of the phone. And that has a problem if you're no longer paying attention to the road, and it creates certain kinds of outcomes where you end up with increased crash risk. In fact, actually, driving by itself is the riskiest activity that any of you guys do. It's the #1 source of accidental death in the U.S., so it's clearly something you take for granted, but it turns out to be the riskiest thing you're doing. We're now seeing, with the advent of a lot of new technology is being taken into the car, either with your smartphone or your car itself is kind of tethered to all this technology, that we're seeing that the fatal crash rates are actually significantly increasing for the first time in over 2 decades. So something's happening in the car, and it's not the car itself. The cars are actually safer. They have airbags and anti-lock brakes and so forth. It's the fact that the driver is actually not driving very well. So what I want to talk to you about is the idea that we're actually now using our voice to try and communicate and control the car in a variety of kinds of ways. It's not just the car. I met with the CEO of Vivint last week, and the Internet of Things means that you're going to be starting to talk to everything in your house too. When you want to go to bed at night, you're going to say, I'm going to bed, and the computers in your house are going to turn the lights down. And I'm leaving, it's going to lock the doors. How many eggs do I have, and how much milk is in the fridge? You'll be able to actually talk to your refrigerator, talk to your house, talk to your car. It sounds good, but what I'm going to show you is that that active talking isn't free, and in the context of doing things like driving a car, it's actually fairly dangerous. But let's actually back up before we get to modern cars and look at, let's see, wake up. Really? There we go. Let's look at what driving was like 110 years ago. So this is actually video from San Francisco, shot in San Francisco just before the earthquake. And you can see it's actually a fairly complex mix of streetcars, pedestrians, horse-drawn carriages, early cars, people just jumping on the back of carts and so forth. It's kind of chaotic. If you look at this, modern driving isn't anywhere near as chaotic as this. Even so, back in 1870, one person was killed by a horse every day in New York because it wasn't a safe place for pedestrians to mix with traffic. And you can see here that it's much more chaotic. We've structured our roads now, so we've tried to separate out pedestrians from cars and the light rail and streetcars from other traffic. But it actually is something that's relatively new in the last 100 years, where we've started to have vehicles, and the vehicles have started to become more complex. But even back in the day, it didn't always go well. So you can see that people were actually having problems driving and being distracted back in the 20s. In fact, the first two cars that were licensed in Ohio crashed into each other. It's like there's only two cars in the entire state, and they managed to run into each other. So it's something that hasn't always gone really well. But what happened was, as we started to become more, there we go. We started to add more and more things to the car that would entertain us. There was concern that was actually going to be a real serious source of distraction. So in the 30s, when they started putting radios into the car, there was laws that were put in place that would say you can't listen to the radio while you're driving because they were worried it would be a source of distraction. You'll see that turns out not to be the case, but they were worried even in the 30s. About 5 states actually considered laws that would outlaw listening to radios while driving, and they're actually, back in the day, even made a little turntable so you could play vinyl records in the car. So they were putting a lot of early technology in there without really concerns about what happened in terms of safety. Now the question is, to what extent, as we add more technology to the car, is that going to be safe? Game-changing from my perspective was what happened when we had the telephone. So the telephone initially looked something like this. It was connected to the wall, so you couldn't really go anywhere. So you couldn't walk out in front of traffic. If you're a pedestrian, you couldn't drive distracted with a cell phone because it was tethered to the wall. And so that, for the longest time, was actually something we didn't realize was going to be a hazard. But in 1973, a guy named Martin Cooper invented the car phone. And you'll notice it's big, it's clunky, it was designed to go in a car. It's not like the smartphone that's really small. It was designed to only be used in the car to try and do business. It was big, it was bulky, it didn't have a big battery, and it kept dropping calls all the time. So it really didn't catch on. But fast forward to now, and this is what everybody carries with them. There are, in the United States, something like 315 million people. There are 320 million cell phone subscribers. So that means, on average, everybody has a cell phone plus a few extras, including every baby and everyone who's really, really old. So people are actually there's a large, huge penetration of these cell phones. The problem is that these cell phones actually start to get plugged into, well, they're no longer a phone. I mean, my son's your age. When I call him, he never answers. But I'll get a text back maybe about a minute to say, what's up? Because he doesn't want to talk anymore. So the people are actually, although this is a phone, people really hardly use it for a phone. They use it for a phone, they use it to text, they can check email, they can surf the internet. This basically is a portal to everything, right? There's hardly anything you really can't do with one of these smartphones now if you've got wireless service. The problem is that it also has Bluetooth pairing, so that anything you can do on this, you can do while you're driving as well. And that's not necessarily safe. You might think, well, is this actually something that's been, maybe it'd be locked out. If it's unsafe, maybe the federal government would have actually established some rules that would have actually said you can't use a cell phone in this context or that. But it turns out that the federal government is completely paralyzed, and so they've actually made no changes or regulations with respect to the use of technology, wireless technology in the vehicle. And so the brave new world is something like this. This is the Tesla. It has a 17-inch display. It has all kinds of electronics that go into it. You pair it to your phone, so all the kinds of things your phone can do in terms of navigation, Facebook interactions, email, and so forth, can actually be streamed to the driver. There are other types of displays we've seen that actually have a heads-up display that'll project an image. If you use FaceTime, project the image of the FaceTime person you're talking to right on the windshield, so you can talk to your mom as you're driving home, and she can see you and you can see her. That's not a good thing, right? So the thing is that, again, you might think, well, number one, maybe the federal government or the state governments are actually trying to regulate this and say what really should be versus not in the car, and the regulatory agencies aren't. You might think that maybe the car companies are actually doing testing to make sure that these devices that they're putting in the car are safe, but they're not either. So what happens is, at this point, is characterized as kind of the Wild West. Anything that they can put in the car, they are putting in the car without any real consideration for whether or not it's a good idea or not. And here's an example of it. Wait up, come on. There we go. Come on, there we go. So this is an ad. There's a zillion ads like this. This is an ad that is promoting one of the new voice-based technologies. About halfway through the ad, there's going to be a little disclaimer that appears right here. So notice that disclaimer as I play this ad. If it plays. There we go. Thank you.
Hey honey, my mom stopped by. We'll see you soon. Hey honey, where the are you going?
We only make one thing, the ultimate driving machine.
So did you notice the little disclaimer that they had at the very bottom? I don't know if you could read it, but it says, do not use this device do not use texting or the voice commands when the car's in motion. But of course, they're showing the person driving while they're using the technology. So what's happening is that these car companies are putting all this technology, and the lawyers are saying you need to basically disclose that this stuff isn't safe to use. But in fact, actually, people aren't really ever reading that, so they just get used to using this kind of technology. So what you saw there was someone was just using voice-based communication to just send and receive text messages or emails. And you might think, well, how dangerous is that? And what I'm going to show you at the very end is that is remarkably difficult to do. It's extremely difficult to do, and I'll show you why it's probably not a good idea to use that kind of technology while driving. So these systems are actually configured so you buy a car, if you buy a new car, you're pretty much going to have this voice-based communication. And it's not going to be very usable, and it's not going to be very safe either. So let's see this. For some reason, it's going wrong. Okay, so what we've really reached at this point is a situation where we're having more and more sources of distraction. People are actually, when they buy a car, the car has internet, it has Facebook, it has email, it has tech calling, it has navigation systems, it has some of the systems that will actually try and control where you in your lane, so you can actually have lane keeping, so you can take your hands off the wheel and it'll try and keep you in your lane. We're adding more and more technology. But the problem is, much of that technology is really distracting. So the solution potentially is to create some kind of, of course, we're reaching this tipping point where the only solution made is put some kind of texting lane where people are driving really slow in kind of an impaired state. You can tell someone who's texting, if you're driving down the road, they look like what they used to look like when they were drunk. They're the person who swerves like this, and you wonder how come they're swerving. You think, did they drink too much? No, and you get up and they're just sending a text message like this. So we know that those kinds of things are really, really dangerous, and we're just seeing that more and more people are doing it. In fact, you can't buy a car that doesn't support those kinds of things, and it's tempting if you have your smartphone to be able to kind of continue to use them. So, why is this getting brief? Just if you wouldn't mind just advancing it. So I want to give you an example in just a second here of kind of everyday multitasking, the kind of thing you may see if you are driving from here to Salt Lake. So if you want to just...
All right, so we're driving on the freeway, and I look over, and this guy is reading a book. And wait. iPad? I think it's a Kindle. Is that a Kindle and a book?
Yo, dog, I hear you like...
No way. You speed up.
He's on his cell phone.
And a Kindle.
That is multitasking.
And a book.
So it's crazy, right? Some guy's reading a book, looking at Kindle, talking on the cell phone, or checking his cell phone. But these things aren't all that uncommon. If you've got that technology, it tends to be very attractive. Some people think it's addicting. When your phone rings, it triggers the reward circuits, triggers dopamine release, and actually, so it's difficult not to look at your phone. We're wired so that the phone is a portal to your social network, and so when that phone rings, you have to look at it. It could be something that's really quite interesting. But we don't multitask. Everyone thinks that they're better multitaskers. If I ask you, at least and you didn't have to show your hand, but on a sheet of paper, I said, how many people think you're really good multitaskers? Most people would say, or a lot of people say that they're really good multitaskers, but that's just not the way our brains are wired. Our brains are not wired to multitask very well. In fact, there we go. Whoop. God. So we have any man who can drive safely and while kissing a pretty girl is simply not giving the kiss the attention it deserves. Okay, so it's been around for a while that we know this is a problem. The law basically law of attention really is that we really don't multitask well. We're really just doing one task at a time, switching back and forth between one activity and the other. Would someone like to try an example? Let me show you how it works. Someone willing to try being a multitasker for a second? Perfect. So all I need you to do, first of all, 3 little things. The first one is, I want you to say the letters A through I as fast as you can. You ready? Go. Perfect. Now I want you to do the numbers 1 through 9 as fast as you can. Are you ready? Go. Both those were easy, right? One more now. I want you to switch back and forth, like A1, B2, C3, and we'll see if it's equally easy. Are you ready? Go ahead. Very good, very good. But very much more difficult, right? You were pairing 2 things that were really easy, almost automatic to do. You've known it for a long time. But now when you have to pair those 2 together, what you're really doing is you're doing one task, then you switch, and you have to do something else, and you have to kind of inhibit the one task, perform the other task, remember where you were back and forth. And so the brain, our human brain, even though the brain is massively parallel and has all these neurons that are connecting, our behavior is distinctly serial. We're really not multitasking, we're really just serially switching back and forth. And it's much more difficult to do than what you typically see if someone is, it's much more difficult to do than doing either task singularly. And you can actually show that in terms of like the workplace, if you look at the modern workplace, about 28% of the work day is lost in that transition from one task to the next, back and forth and back and forth. Okay. So I want to give you an example now of the real world in terms of multitasking. So this is someone who's driving. It's shot from a traffic intersection, and someone's driving. But notice that there's no traffic. The driving conditions are benign. It's bright day. There's no bad weather. It's unobstructed view. As the person's driving by, they say, last I saw, the light was red. And this isn't one of those things where he's running a red light that just turned red. You can see it's been red for a while. In fact, if I start this video, I'm going to show you a video, and there's a fairly violent collision that happens. The person, though, who's driving is using a hands-free cell phone. So his eyes are on the road, his hands are on the wheel. He shouldn't be distracted because he's paying attention, right? But he's not because he's talking on the phone. And so what happens is you can see the light's red for 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, and he just comes right through and then smashes into the side of a vehicle. That is a very common type of accident, type of inattention where the driver simply is not looking. It's also a very serious accident. This person was lucky they survived, but it's likely as not with that kind of a collision that you die at that speed because there's very little safety equipment on the side of the vehicle like that. That T-bone is extremely dangerous. And that kind of a crash, I get calls from attorneys like probably once a week about crashes just like that. The person was on a cell phone or they were texting and they ran into something and they ran a red light, they didn't see it. How could they not see it? It was red. Well, it's because their brain was doing something else. They were, in terms of switching back and forth and doing that multitasking, they were in the process of conversation and not in the process of paying attention to what they were seeing. So we think about when you're distracted and when you're that you're distracted because you take your eyes off the road. And that's pretty clear. If you take your eyes off the road, if you close your eyes while driving, you're going to steer off the road, right? And if you take your hands off the wheel, that's going to be problematic too. And that's one of the reasons why we know that texting is a problem, because the average text takes your eyes off the road for 4 seconds. Try driving at freeway speeds and take your eyes off the road for 4 seconds and see where you go. You're going to eventually start to have this kind of lane deviating behavior where you're going to be swerving back and forth in your lane, and everyone behind you can see that you're impaired. So that's one of the reasons why we really understand that texting, manual texting, is a problem. Harder to tell, and what I've been focusing on in my research, is what happens when you get distracted because you're not paying attention. Your eyes are on the road, your hands are on the wheel, but you're just not mentally paying attention to what you're seeing. We refer to that as cognitive distraction. It's much harder to see. By the way, the CEO of Ford says it doesn't exist. So he doesn't have a complete understanding of how the mind works in this case. But that's a problem, right? If the CEO of a major car company, the #1 producer of vehicles in the United States, says that you can't be distracted, all you need to do is keep your eyes on the road, and they engineer cars with that premise, troubles are going to happen, right? We also know that there's certain kinds of things that are just not that distracting. Listening to radio isn't a real problem. We know, though, that there are other kinds of things you can do, just far enough away that I have to stand like that, there we go, that are kind of more moderate in terms of distraction. These are things like talking on a cell phone. When you talk on a cell phone, it takes attention away from the task of operating the vehicle, and you miss things just like that person who drove through the red light that I showed you a second ago. That's moderate. But what we're seeing, and I'm going to show you later today, is that the new ways in which, if you buy a new car and it comes with all this technology, it allows you to be able to update Facebook and to post text message and things like that, that far eclipses the cell phone that we were worried about 10 years ago. It's far, far more dangerous. And when we think about what happens in terms of a driver, we refer to this in terms of something called the spider model. And it basically says what a driver needs to do in order to be able to safe driver is to scan for hazards, to predict where various hazards might occur, identify what they see, make good decisions, and then be fast at executing a response. Scan, predict, identify, decide, and execute a response. And all of those activities, all those spider-related activities, are dependent upon you paying attention to the driving. When you start to talk on a cell phone, what you see is that people just, in terms of scanning, they stare straight ahead like a zombie. They don't look side to side. They don't predict hazards. They actually start to drive like the novice driver who hasn't had any training. They just like when you're 16 years old and think how difficult it was in terms of all the things you missed. Talking on a cell phone makes you drive like that again. You don't identify things that are right in front of you, so that's that inattentional blindness that you saw with the person who drove through the intersection. How could they not see this? Well, it fell on their retina, so it's not just where they were looking, it's that they weren't paying attention to what they saw. Then making a decision, making a good decision about when to go or not, whether to turn or not, that turns out to be significantly important. And then how quickly you can make a response. When people start to get distracted, when people start to talk on a cell phone or do other kinds of things that take attention from driving, it gets rid of all those spider-related activities and makes you a less aware driver. You're more likely to be involved in a crash, more likely to run red lights, more likely to put yourself and others at risk. So what I want to tell you about now is some of the research we've been doing that is designed to try and understand this cognitive distraction, what's happening inside the head. And it's harder to tell what's going on because I can tell if you're looking at your text message. I can see that because your eyes are off the road and your hands are off the wheel. That's easy to tell. But how do you tell if someone's not paying attention? You have to use more cognitive neuroscience techniques, and that's what I'm going to show you. We know it's very difficult. We know that we developed a technique or a scale for trying to rate various kinds of things, like listening to the radio, listening to a book on tape, and so forth. And we looked at some of the newer technologies that are starting to be put into the vehicle. And we developed a relatively simple rating system that ranged from 1 to 5. I'll show you how that works in a second. But you can basically put all the kinds of things that people do or could do in the car and say which is more dangerous than others. And this is part of a big project that we've done with AAA, the Auto Club. And so they came and developed a little promotional video that kind of shows exactly how we were doing the research. And so I want to show you this just for a moment.
Please say a command after the beep dial.
Yeah, I think people are less distracted by the voice-activated things in cars.
It's a lot safer. It's nice to be able to keep my full attention on the road.
I don't think that's a distraction at all.
I'm sorry, I did not catch that.
What the hands-free systems currently mean is you press a button, you engage in this dialogue, it has errors, you get frustrated. There's this promise of hands-free interaction, but the reality is not there.
AAA and the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety partnered with mental distraction expert Dr. David Strayer to uncover why use of these seemingly safer dashboard technologies can lead to dangerous distractions behind the wheel.
Update Facebook status.
We look at brain potentials, we look at reaction time, we look at a number of characteristics about how a driver behaves. For us, that's really the interesting question. How do you tell when someone's distracted, even if they don't realize that they're distracted?
Saturday is going well. So glad.
Determined to dig deeper into this phenomenon, participants were first trained on how to use voice-activated technologies, and then were guided through a series of common voice-only tasks.
A lot of the research suggests that speech production tends to be a big source of the workload.
So if you jump into a system and you're engaged in this task for a prolonged period of time, your mental workload is going to be quite high.
Number deleted. Please say the number again.
Play CD.
Tuning to AM 850.
Oh, heavens. This is not the right command. I was with a person that actually pulled out in front of a car that had no intention of stopping.
I'm thinking I'm slowing down, but I'm still not pressing the brake hard enough. I'd stop just right there after the line.
Some of the cars, the voice commands were set up to where there are a lot more steps involved.
The most distracting thing with the hands-free was honestly setting a radio station.
I had a hard time focusing on what I was supposed to be doing.
I felt stressful trying to respond to the emails.
It just seems like it takes just as much concentration to use as just texting would.
With the evidence-based data from this research, AAA is calling for developers to leverage these results to develop safer voice-activated technologies to bring the mental workload level down to be no more demanding than listening to the radio.
Until you've had one of those 60-mile-per-hour car crashes where your life literally flashes before your eyes, at what point do you sit back and think, well, maybe I shouldn't?
So in our process of actually trying to understand this, we were trying to understand something about why these systems could be distracting. And so we developed a workload scale, and then we've actually tried it out on a bunch of new vehicles. Our workload scale looks like something like this. In the first phase, we had 8 tasks that we tried people to test it on. One was just driving without any distraction. And on our workload scale, that's a category 1 in terms of how easy or difficult it is. That's a workload associated with driving without anything else to do besides just drive. And we had people either, while they're driving, listen to the radio, or listen to a book on tape, or talk to a passenger, or talk on a handheld or hands-free cell phone, or then use these voice-based systems to actually send and receive emails or texts, the kinds of stuff that is in new cars. And then finally, the last thing we had was people doing a task called the operation span task. It's a task that was designed to study working memory capacity. It's very difficult to do, and it requires people to simultaneously be solving math problems in your head and remembering memory and remembering various items and then recalling them in the right order. No one in their right mind would do that, right? It's, right? You're not going to volition. I guarantee you. You're welcome to try it afterwards if you'd like, but I guarantee you really wouldn't want to do that. We set that as our high water mark, thinking that would be the level of distraction that we should never get to. What I'm going to show you is when you're interacting with things like Siri, your workload is at that level. And then we took a variety of measures. This is the kind of way we actually measured it, where we looked measures of how well people drove, their subjective measures, their physiological measures, measuring brain activity and heart rate and so forth. Pulled those together to create our workload scale, and we measured it both in the driving simulator on the left and in an instrument vehicle on the right. And you can see the subjects here are having their brain activity recorded, as well as other kinds of behavioral measures we're taking, so we can get a measure of how they're behaving as they're driving and how distracted they are. And come on, there we go. So here's our workload scale. Single task driving is on the left, that's a category 1, and that horrible memory math task is category 5. If you look at things like listening to the radio, it hardly has any effect at all. It's just a teeny little increase in the level of workload. If we add something like listening to a book on tape, it elevates the workload a little bit. Talking to a passenger increases it more, and actually talking to a passenger or talking on a handheld or hands-free cell phone has the exact same level of distraction. But what was surprising to us was these speech-based systems where you're talking and using your voice to send and receive emails with a computerized system that was perfect. It's not like Siri that makes mistakes. The one we tested in the lab was designed to be perfect. It had a category 3 level of workload. So some stuff we weren't too worried about, like listening to the radio and book on tape, you can do those activities without increased level of workload. Talking on a handheld or hands-free cell phone pushes the workload to higher levels. Passenger conversations, this is the workload the driver is experiencing. What we see with adult drivers is while the driver has a high level of workload, the passenger tends to compensate for it. And so that if the driver misses something, the passenger will help identify and say, watch out for this threat. So it turns out actually the overall crash risk for passengers is actually lower, more like listening to the radio or a book on tape. But for us, the speech-to-text kinds of thing, where you're using your voice to send and receive emails or texts, was a 3 on the, and this was the perfect system, 3 on out of a 5-point scale. So we're creating and engineering a society where we're distracted all the time. We're distracted by cell phones and devices, and we drive in a blind case, or in this case here, we're walking where we almost need some kind of assistive technology because we're so distracted. What we've done now is, and the last I want to tell you about, is work we've done using and looking at the voice-based technologies in brand new cars. So if you're going to purchase a new car, 2015, 2016, they're having more and more electronics. That's actually their selling point. They all fairly look very similar. The big differences and differentiation is the electronics that are put in the car. And so we tested these systems either in the car, or we also tested using Apple, Siri, Google Now, or Cortana, using the voice-based assistants. We had people driving down the road, and every so often we tell them to do things like tune the radio, and they tune the radio. That little pink area would be the time they were actually actively involved in the tuning task, or changing the radio. And then there'd be kind of a period of time, this little blue interval, where they're just driving without anything else. And they'd be told to do something like place a call, and then there'd be a period of time afterwards where the call had finished placing the call. So we refer to these places, the pink areas, as when you're actively talking to the car or you're actively talking to your phone. And these little blue areas are what we refer to as IVIS, stands for the in-vehicle information. So in-vehicle information systems, they finished talking to the car, they finished talking to the phone, and now they're just back in driving mode. And so when we look at this, we see that in terms of the driving, if they're just driving in single task where they haven't been using the phone, they're fast. That's category 1. If they're driving and doing that memory math task, it's a category 5 level of workload. If they've just finished and they're just driving after having talked to their phone, you see that there's a significant kind of bump up here, and that increases kind of a residual cost, the cost of having to switch from talking to the phone to kind of going back to just driving. And if you look at what happens when people are actively talking to the smartphone or to the car, their workload is the same as what it was if people were doing that memory math task. And I'll show you a bit more about that in a second. So we see that when people are actively talking to the car, when you're talking to your car, talking to your smartphone, the workload ratings are very, very high, category 5 in terms of levels of workload. A number of people, when they say, do you text while you're driving? A lot of times people say, I don't text while driving. Anybody admit to texting while driving? No one will. At least you're honest. Most of you probably do. Many of you actually might say, well, I'm not going to text while I'm driving, but I'll just text at a red light. What we see is when you hang up and stop interacting with the system, it takes up to 27 seconds for that distraction to clear. So I'm sending a text, light turns green, I start to go. You're still really distracted. This is kind of the residual level of distraction that we found lasts for up to 27 seconds after you send a text message. So even sending a text at a traffic light when you're stopped can actually make you impaired when you start to go again. If we look at what happens, we looked at people across the age range. People in the 20s actually turned out to actually have the fastest reaction times. But if you look at across the age range from 21 to 70, there's a difference between younger, middle, and older age drivers. What you typically find is people slow down as they get older. That's kind of a general law of slowing. But when people, that's just in single task conditions. When our drivers were actually talking to the system, the differences between younger and older drivers was doubled. So older drivers in particular are really having a difficult time using these voice-based technology. But that doesn't mean that it's safe for college students to do it either. It's just that if you look at someone who's 50 or older, they're really impaired. They're also the people who are most likely to buy these cars with this new technology, so it's this double whammy of them buying it and then not being able to use it. So we see this. We see that basically the costs are more than double. If we kind of look now at the smartphones, this is actually now using, if you have an Android phone or you have an Apple phone, you're using that voice assistant like Siri to try and send and receive emails and texts and so forth. What we found when people are trying to do that, here's our single task. And so that's our category 1. Here's our memory math task. This is where we're trying to do that horrible memory math task that no one would in their right mind would do while they're driving. The IVIS 0, this is the period of time when you're not talking on the cell phone, you're just driving, and you can see that, but you have been using Apple or Google or Siri. Google is significantly better than Apple and Microsoft. Microsoft even has a personal assistant that no one uses because only 1% of people have that phone. But watch what happens when people are talking to or using Siri or Google. Here's this voice, they're actually talking, and so they're here sending text messages with Siri or with Android, Google Now, or on Microsoft. It's the same level of workload as doing that memory math task. So even though the car companies are promoting all this technology that allows people to use voice-based systems, they're surprisingly distracting, surprisingly high levels of workload. They're large costs. And so if you look across the ratings, these are now the 15 vehicles we tested. There are some that have a relatively good user interface and relatively easy to use. But for the exact same system, the Mazda, for example, has a 4.6 on our 5-point rating compared to like the Chevy Equinox. That's the exact same interactions, but in one case, the car company has kind of raced to put the technology out there, and it's extremely difficult or frustrating to use. So I guess the message is you're starting to try and use or think about using your smartphone, or if you drive a car that has all these fancy bells and whistles, watch out, because the technology is not very easy to use. And to kind of give you an example of how that might be the case, Jimmy Kimmel followed up on the study we did using Siri and wanted to know what would happen if you use Siri for other kinds of situations besides driving.
AAA did a study in conjunction with the University of Utah and found that out of all the voice-activated systems, Siri, the Apple, is the worst one. My Siri and I are not on the same page. It's funny, you know, we would not put up with Siri in any other situation in life. I mean, imagine what it would be like if Siri was a waitress.
What can I help you with?
I'm still deciding on what to eat, but I would like a coffee.
Here's what I found. There are several coffee shops close to you. 6 of them are very close. Starbucks at 643.
No, I don't want Starbucks. I don't have to. You know, just bring me a Coca-Cola.
The time in Angola, Zaire is 1:16 a.m.
No, you know what? No drink. I'll have the chicken Caesar salad.
I found 5 results for Wicked Weezer ballads.
Not Wicked Weezer ballad. Chicken Caesar salad.
Okay, got it. Visiting Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada. Dialing
No, 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 do
702.
not cancel call. Siri, cancel call. Listen to me. I want a chicken Caesar salad.
Okay, got it. I'll be right back. Here you go. Crickets, cheese, and chowder.
No, 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 no.
Is there anything else I can help you with?
No, no,
Okay, how much would you like to tip me?
nothing.
Hot wings, coming right up.
No, 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 no. I actually do like hot wings. That would be all right. Would anybody like this bowl of crickets and cheese? Yes, here you go. Enjoy.
So the thing is, got it. So the thing is actually, Jimmy Kimmel got it exactly in terms of the way in which your interactions work. How many of you guys try and use Siri or Google to try and do things on your phone? Does it always go well? Occasionally it'll send the wrong message to the wrong person, right? Or it'll dial the wrong person, or it'll send a message that's not the message you want. Well, in the case, the brave new world that your car companies have is that your interface with the car is going to be more and more of using Siri to control it. And having just talked to Vivint, their view of the world in terms of your home is going to be that you're going to be talking to your home, and you're going to be talking to like you talk to your car. And in both cases, you're going to end up things with like crickets, cheese, and chowder rather than what you really want. So we know these voice-based systems are difficult to use. It's alluring to think that they're easy to use, but in terms of how the brain works, it doesn't work very well. Long residual costs, watch out, because even if you do things like text at a red light when it turns green, you're still distracted from that interaction. Practice can improve performance, but the thing is, even if you give people a week of practice, they still have difficulty using it. Everyone's having problems across the age range, but older adults, people who are most likely to purchase this technology, are really slammed by it. And you can actually build these systems so that they're not horribly distracting, but many of them right now are super frustrating. So the message basically is at this point, watch out, because the technology that is kind of looks really flashy in the car, if you don't test it, if you're in the process of the next few years, if you start to buy a car, think about buying a car, realize that a lot of that technology is in the car is designed basically to look really nice, but it doesn't necessarily isn't compatible with the way that the brain works. It's very distracting, very frustrating, and expensive. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions if you have any questions. Any questions, anybody? What do you think about, if you guys have heard about the autonomous vehicle, self-driving car? So one of the solutions that many auto manufacturers have come up with is people are just so tied to their technology, they're never going to give it up. And so the only way, in fact, actually people, 20% of college students sleep with their phone under their pillow. So that if a text comes in, they can answer it. They don't use it as an alarm clock, they're actually tethered to it. You go to situations around, go out to dinner or something like that, and you'll see people who are texting to other people, and they're just across the table, but they're sending a text. So the idea is that we're so tethered to our technology that we won't hang up. And so let's make these cars that are self-driving so that I get in the car and I say, take me to school, and then it'll drive you to school. Hopefully it won't confuse where it needs to go, but they're trying to take the act of driving away from you. And that's likely to be in your lifetime. You'll experience the self-driving car that will actually transform. So probably as transformational as the internet. You won't necessarily even have to buy a car. You'll basically just call the car with your phone. The car will show up. You'll get to where you need to go, kind of like an Uber type model. So you won't need to drive. But that's the vision in the next 20 or 30 years. Why? Because we're so wedded to the technology, and the technology is so distracting, we're unlikely to be able to put it down. So that's one of the reasons why the safety people are concerned. We're seeing a significant increase in the number of fatal crashes, not because the cars are less crash worthy, but because there's more and more technology is shoehorned into the car that's really, really distracting. So, any questions? Yeah. So the question is, how's a manual versus an automatic transmission change? Well, you're more likely to be tempted into using this technology with an automatic transmission. In the U.S., about 95% of cars are automatic transmission. You go to, if you go to Europe, it's kind of reversed. You see more manual transmission. In Europe, they also are less likely to use this technology. So by making the cars automatic, you're leading people to be more likely to engage in talking on a cell phone, updating Facebook, those kinds of technologies. Yeah. So one of the things that you hear a lot of is that sometimes you think that maybe women are better at multitasking than men. When we've looked to see that, at least in this context, there's no difference. Men and women are exactly the same, equally distracted. Some of the anthropologists suggest that maybe in certain hunter-gatherer type environments that women may be better at multitasking than men. But at least in this technology-infused environment, both men and women are equally bad. Good question. Any other questions? Yeah. Right, so the question is, do we look to see if there are differences in how often people use their cell phones versus not? Most of the people we studied, the vast majority, are pretty heavy users. So they use cell phones and they use them on a regular basis, and they also use those cell phones and that technology in the course of, even while they're driving, even though they ought not to. One of the things we did to kind of test to see to what extent training and experience would matter is we actually gave people the cars for a week and said, go out there and use them for a week, and we'll come back a week later and see if you've gotten any better. They do get a little better, but only a little better. And so if it was hard to use at the get-go and you can't figure out how to use it right at the beginning, you're going to basically struggle forever. A bad interface, a bad way of kind of interacting with that technology just can't be practiced away. Yeah. It's certainly possible, although one of the things that might kind of convince the insurance companies not to do that is that most of the new cars also have a lot of adaptive systems to try and make the cars safer. Lane departure warning, adaptive cruise control, things like that will help to try and reduce some of the distracted driving kinds of errors. It's not clear that they're going to kind of balance off. We were trying one of the latest, GM has a lane departure system where you can, when you activate it, it will just read the lines on the right, and you can just take your hands off the road and just drive, say, from here to, on a straight section of road from here to Salt Lake City. And it would actually, the car would just kind of, in theory, kind of just stay in the middle of the lane. You'd never have to touch the steering wheel. In practice, what happens is the car starts to oscillate more rapidly, like it starts to look like one of these drunk drivers and actually veers out of his lane eventually. So technology may eventually get there to kind of make it so that it's a little safer, but right now we're being experimented with in terms of all this technology can be put in the car. Much of it doesn't work, much of it's kind of expensive, and it looks good, but it doesn't always work as well as you'd like. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. To what extent does our observation somehow alter the way that the driver experiences things? About half of our subjects didn't have the skull cap and the DRT and all those other kind of, all the wires and everything like that that we use to get precise measurements. And when they didn't have it, they produce the same kind of impairments. So it's always the thing you need to worry about is if you're doing some kind of stuff where you're measuring and collecting all this data, is that in and of itself causing problems? When we tested to see if that was a problem, there were some very minuscule effects of that. The vast majority of the problems people experienced was just talking to Siri or talking to the car. So Okay, super. So if you guys have any questions afterwards, come on up. Otherwise, thank you for coming.